each day. My heart is good. That's a way of saying, how are you? This is the sign that the Native Americans use for heart, because your heart hangs down in the middle, kind of like this. So that's a heart, and this means good. So my heart is good. Got a question for you. Do you want to trade? These are some of the signs that they would use between the different tribes to talk to each other. They didn't really talk because they couldn't speak the same languages. But when they did the hand talk, they could sign with each other and they could understand what they were talking about. They could point to things that they wanted, and then they could trade. So these are some of the items that the white men brought that the natives absolutely loved. This was in the early days of the mountain men. They wanted to trade with them to get the furs. After a while, though, they broke the laws. See, Lewis and Clark had made deals with these chiefs of all these different tribes. And they said that they promised that they would not come into their lands and take their hides and the furs without permission or without some sort of payment. Well, before too long, people decided that hauling all this stuff out to the Indians was just too much work, too expensive, and they decided that they would go hunt and trap these animals on their own at a great risk. But for the most part, Indians loved all the things that the white men had to bring. It's kind of a misconception. A lot of people think that they didn't want to have anything to do with the white man's stuff. They actually really loved most of it because it was better than anything they could produce. And we'll go through some of those items here right now. Many mountain men were friendly with tribes. There were some tribes, though, that were still kind of leery of making trade deals with the white men. Sometimes they would rip off these individual men who came out into the middle of their lands and take all their things and kill them. Other times, sometimes the men would actually assimilate into the tribe and become members of the tribe, although that was rare. For the most part, though, the white men would come out, they would bring their gear, they would bring all these things to trade. The Indians would trade furs for these things, and they both got what they wanted. And they both thought they were ripping each other off, and that's the funny thing. So I'm gonna share with you a little bit about how the trade worked with mountain men and the plains and mountain Indians. So one of the first things that everyone always wants to know is, where did the Indians get their guns? Well, they got them from traders. Sometimes they got them from British and French, giving them weapons, hoping that they would clear out some of the Americans even. Maybe they were hoping that they would wipe out some of the other tribes, or maybe they were just giving them, because this is what they wanted. They wanted superior weaponry against their own enemies, their own enemy tribes, not just the white men. And so they were willing to trade whatever it took to make these deals to get weapons so that they could kill other Indians. And, a lot of people don't necessarily see it that way or speak about it that much, but it was true. And one of the biggest weapons was, of course, the musket. Now, this gun has been chopped down. This has been altered by a native. You can see that the barrel has been shortened and that it's been decorated with tacks. And these tacks would have been traded to the Indians too, and they absolutely loved trading for these because they would decorate all kinds of things. They would decorate tomahawks with them, they would decorate guns, they would decorate all war clubs, all kinds of things with these tacks, and they were a very popular item to trade. But the gun was very, very valuable. Now this one, if you notice, has a feather on it. This feather is not just there for the good looks, it's actually a meaning of something. It tells you a story. In this particular Indians tribe, a feather attached to the gun meant that you had killed an enemy with the gun, or with a gun. And so this was not just something that looked nice, it was something that showed other people that, hey, I'm a pretty bad guy because I've killed other people with guns. And this is proof right here. This is like sort of like a war medal that you might see on a soldier's outfit. This is what natives did. They had war medals or war trophies. Sometimes they would attach scalps of their enemies onto the guns or onto their war clubs or tomahawks or whatever it happened to be. And so the various things that the Indians wore that showed you what kind of things they'd been in, what kind of things they'd done, and how tough a warrior they were. But one of the things that enhanced that was things that the white men brought. And of course the gun is one of the highest valued trade items. They would be willing to trade 10 buffalo hides for one gun. And it didn't matter what kind of gun it was. It didn't matter if it was a muzzleloader where you poured everything down the barrel and shoved it down with a ramrod, or if it was something that had cartridges later on in the days of cartridge weapons. They didn't care. They wanted something that was short, which is why this gun was cut off, They wanted something that was quick and easy on the back of a horse. So while they're riding on their horse, they could just shoot off to the sides or shoot behind them. Something really quick and up close. The reason Indians liked to use guns like this that were shortened, and even pistols were very popular with natives. They liked to use them because when they killed an enemy, they wanted to see the look on their face, because they knew that the enemy knew they were going to die, and they loved that. They lived for that. So having weapons was a highly trade item. They would trade horses, they would trade pelts. Again, if they had access to buffalo, they would trade about 10 buffalo hides. That's a lot of work to get one buffalo hide done, but 10 of them for this, well, that's a lot of work put in to just get this one gun. So you can tell by that this was a very highly traded item, or a highly valuable trade item. Another item of weaponry are arrowheads. Now you're probably thinking, why arrowheads? Didn't they have arrowheads? Yeah, they did. But they were made of bone, or they were made of horn, or they were made of stone that was chipped into shape. Now most of those, when they hit something hard, like other bone on an animal or a person, or if they go through a bird and they hit a rock behind it, they shatter. And those arrowheads are really only good for one use. These, however, these are made by the white men in factories, and they're hammered out metal. And each of the, they got 10 of these here, and I could trade 10 of these arrowheads for one buffalo pelt, one whole buffalo hide. Now a buffalo hide is really big, and these are really small, and you're thinking, gosh, those white guys are taking advantage of the red guys. What's going on here? Well, the white men, they were giving weapons to the Indians that they would eventually use on the white men, but they figured the traders didn't care, because the traders are the ones giving them to them. They're not going to kill me if I keep bringing back things that they want. But the other thing that's interesting is the natives actually thought they were ripping off the white man, because these were reusable. They could bend them back into shape if they had hit a rock or something. They could sharpen them again. They didn't have to worry about it breaking, because this is made of metal. And so this iron arrowhead could be used over and over and over. And so they thought, hey, you stupid white man, you're giving me something I can use over and over again. Yeah, I'll give you a buffalo hide for 10 of those. I'm ripping you off. So they each thought they were ripping each other off. And that's kind of the irony of it, is they thought they were getting the better deal. Who actually got the better deal, we may never know. But 10 arrowheads for one buffalo hide, that seems like a pretty crazy deal, especially when you think that these are probably made for less than a penny each, in a factory somewhere, and hammered out by a blacksmith or whatever. So Indian arrowheads, another item that was easy to carry. Mountain men had to carry this on the backs of horses. They didn't have train access. They could bring wagons, but you can't get wagons across very easily, and so you make a good target too. So tomahawks were another very popular trade item. Now you're thinking, well wait, isn't that a Native American weapon? Yes, it is. However, the metal warhead, the arrowhead, or the head itself, is made of metal. Now this metal is really strong, of course, and just like we talked about with the arrowheads, it can be reused, it can be sharpened very sharp. It's not going to break like a stone one would, and so this is far superior to anything the Native Americans could make. And so that's why this was a very highly trade item. Now something else that was used by Native Americans was tobacco. When the white men came, they brought these tomahawks with them, and they knew that the natives liked to smoke. So somebody got really clever, and they figured, what if I drilled a hole all the way through the pipe, drilled a hole in the back here for a bowl, and they could put tobacco in here, and they could light it up, and they could smoke it, and then maybe chop somebody's head off, or maybe chop somebody's head off and then smoke it as a victory peace pipe. Whatever the case, that's what these were made for, and these were highly, highly popular amongst native out west. So one thing that was traded to the natives in the early days that later on was made illegal was whiskey. Now whiskey, this is made out of stoneware. This is just like clay, but this isn't the part that was the valuable part. It was the whiskey that was inside. Now the whiskey inside would obviously make somebody drunk. Now Native Americans and white men alike, they could both get drunk on the same amount of whiskey. The only problem is the natives didn't really know when to stop. And, well, actually, a lot of white men didn't know when to stop. Still don't. But the point I'm trying to make here is, if you're trading with somebody and you get them drunk, they could get angry. They could kill you. Well, that's not good business. And so people figured out after a while, let's not trade whiskey to the Indians anymore, because it just kind of gets us in trouble, gets them in trouble, and it's not a good situation for anyone. Eventually, the U.S. government actually made it illegal for alcohol to be traded to the Indians. As you can see, I'm wearing a different hat this hat is a winter hat, and as you can tell around me, it's winter time. So no better time to have a hat. Now this hat is made out of badger fur. Now that doesn't mean that it was anything special, it just was something that was handy. Now for a white man, badger fur didn't necessarily mean anything other than it looked kind of cool. But if you notice here, you'll see that these feathers and this beaded rosette, these are adornments that natives would have really valued. White men weren't especially fond of them because, well, they didn't really have any meaning for them. They might have looked cool and somebody might have had something like this on their hat. Maybe it was a gift from the tribe, who knows. But in any event, it would be something that the natives were looking for. This might be a little bit of advertising, because one of the big trade items for Native Americans was beads. Now what do they do with these beads? Well, I just showed you one example, but these are rings and rings of beads, and they come in different colors. And these are just a couple examples here. So you could bring bags of beads out west on a horseback, and in pouches on a horseback, and bring it out. And if you knew your tribe that you were trading with, you'd bring the colors that they liked. Not every tribe liked the same colors. Some of them, of course, whites and blacks and reds were pretty basic, but some tribes like greens, and some tribes like soft pastel blues, and some like pink, and some like yellows and purples, and there was all kinds of different colors that different tribes liked. So if you got to know your tribe really well that you were trading with, if you traded with one or two or maybe a few different tribes, you would know which beads to bring them and which they would want more than others. The other thing that you had to be careful about is if you brought the wrong beads to the wrong tribe, they might say, hey, that's the color of the enemy tribe. Are you trading with them? Then you might be in trouble. So you had to be very careful, and you had to know who you were dealing with when you were doing these things. But other things that could be made from beads, and various types of sizes and shapes and colors of beads, they could make Indian war breastplates. Now this breastplate, this is just a quick mock-up. This would be something that you would have seen in the 1870s, 1880s. But this breastplate here is made of bone and brass beads, and silver beads, and of course it's all tied together with leather. The white men wouldn't have made it like this and sent it out there. They would have just traded the beads themselves, and the natives would have put them together the way that they wanted to. So the trading of beads was very valuable. Now, what is a breastplate going to do? Is it going to stop an arrow, stop a bullet? It's not going to do either of that. It's just there to look really cool. So if you saw an Indian wearing a breastplate, you knew that he had a lot of extra money or stuff to trade. He was very wealthy, and he could afford to buy, well, cool-looking stuff, bling, if you want to call it that, that other people necessarily wouldn't be able to buy because they wanted stuff that they could actually use, things that they needed. And so that was a status symbol of more than anything. But other things that weren't status symbols, that just were kind of normal decoration, were this kind of beading on shoes and on clothes and things like that. Beading adornment on straps for rifles and muskets and other things like that. These would be things that they would decorate to, well, it's just something that we all like to do. We like to decorate. And so Indians, before they had glass beads that were shipped in by the white men, they used to use quills from porcupine, and they would take the quill off the porcupine very carefully. Probably the porcupine's dead, poor porcupine. And they would take that quill, and then they would cut one end because it's filled with air, and then they would start wrapping it around something, whatever it was, like a stick or something to make, or a piece of leather, to make their designs. And it was a lot of tedious work, and it's a hard thing to try and get porcupines all the time. And glass beads looked a lot better. They were shinier. They came in really bright colors. Native Americans could never dye anything this bright of a red, and so vermilion red or something like this was very valuable. Paints, too, were also very rare to get in this kind of a color in the wild, and so actually impossible, and at least in the Americas. And so getting something, a paint that was that bright of a red vermilion, would be very, very valuable as well. Because natives like to dress themselves up in paint to go into war. And just like the decorations that we talked about on the gun, they decorated themselves and their horses. They didn't just put these handprints and lightning bolts on the horses and themselves for no reason, just because it looked cool. They actually told a story. Sometimes these things were supposed to enhance the power of the animal or enhance the power of themselves, but sometimes, having a paint on one side showed that you had been attacked on that side by a warrior. Lots of different things that white men really didn't know a whole lot about. They just know they like this stuff, and so I'm going to bring it to them. Another thing that Native Americans really liked were sound makers. Now this isn't what it's officially called. This is a hawk bell. These bells were made to tie around the legs of hawks. I'm sure you've seen them in the Middle Ages. They used to have hawks that, you know, they would fly out and they would go kill a rabbit or something and bring it back. But so they knew where their bird was, they had this little bell wrapped around their leg, and that's what these were originally made for. Native Americans, though, they weren't interested in hunting with birds. They used these in their decoration and for noise when they danced. So Native Americans liked to dance, and when they danced, they would wear cowrie shells that were really close to each other, and when they danced, these shells would rattle against each other and make a noise. But the hawk bell would make a lot brighter, or sharper, louder, metallic kind of a noise, and a whole bunch of these on an outfit would sound really cool while they're doing their dances. Most of these dances, of course, had religious meanings and purposes to them, and so this was something to enhance that. So the hawk bells, something as simple as a tiny little bell, sleigh bell or whatever you want to call them, different size. The hawk bells are smaller, obviously, but these bells would be very useful for Native American dress and regalia when they were doing their religious dances. Other items of trade that you might not have expected to be as popular would be tinware and ironware. Now, a tin cup, you wouldn't think too many Indians would drink from a tin cup, but what did they carry their water in? What did they carry anything in? Well, they carried it in the bladders of animals, and those are easily burst or torn, and so having metal things to carry things in, it's a lot easier. You can cook with this. You could put beans or something in there and set it over a fire like a soldier used to do, or, you know, you could just drink from it. But this was very much requested by the Native American women, because they wanted something that was easier to cook in. Think about it. If you were going to try and cook a stew and you didn't have an iron pot, what would you cook it in? Maybe a clay pot? Well, the clay pot could crack or break eventually. If you didn't have access to clay, you could use, well, what could you use? I mean, you could weave a basket, but if you set a basket in a fire, it's going to burn. So what they would do is they would take hot rocks that they heated in a fire and then place them in a basket and then put it underground to cook. Well, that's kind of a pain in the butt. So they could put all that work into cooking and cleaning, or cooking all their food, and then maybe risk losing a basket and maybe not really heating their food that fast. Or they could get a big iron pot that would be a special order item, if you will, because not every mountain man's going to be bringing this big heavy pot on the back of a horse. So that would be a highly prized item of trade too. But that was more something that the women were requesting because, well, the women did a lot of the cooking. Something else that was very popular with Native Americans is different ways to start fires. Now, anyone knows that you can take two appropriate pieces of rock, maybe flint, scrape them together, and you can start a fire. You could do the same thing with the back edge of a knife that's iron, or maybe a piece of steel like this, and you scrape it, and it creates a spark. That's how you can catch that spark, get a fire going. That takes a long time, though, and it may not be very good in a country like this where we're wet and it's snowy, really cold. It may not take. So if it's sunny out, you can start a fire with a magnifying glass. Now, they didn't call it a magnifying glass. They referred to it as a burning lens, just like, you know, some of those horror stories of kids burning ants. You could take this and line it up with the sun so that it sets fire to whatever you're trying to start. So a magnifying glass, a simple burning lens like this, would be a very valuable trade item because it made things easier. You know, you could light up your pipe really quick. Just go out and outside of your teepee and light it up really fast and you're done. Didn't even have to work at it. So a magnifying glass was a very valuable trade item, not something you normally think of. Another valuable trade item were mirrors. Mirrors came in all kinds of different shapes and sizes, but something small like this would have been very practical for a mountain man to take out west because, well, it's kind of small and you can fit a whole bunch of them in the back, in the pack of a horse. So they would bring these mirrors out there, and you're thinking, well, why would they need a mirror? Well, they got to put war paint on. They're going to put the war paint on. They want to do it very precisely. They want to make it look good. And they could go down to the river or the pond or lake or wherever they're at, and they could look at the water and they could put it in. But that means you got to get out of your teepee, you got to take all your paint stuff with you, and it's kind of a pain. But if you have a mirror, you could attach it to a block of wood or something like that, a stick, prop it up, or somebody else could hold it, and you could put the makeup on yourself for war, and you wouldn't even have to leave your teepee. So something like this was a luxury item, but it was something that Native Americans were requesting and something the white men kept bringing out. One of the things that Lewis and Clark brought were these trade medallions. Now, these trade medallions were not something that white men brought out very regularly. These were brought out by military groups, Lewis and Clark was technically a military expedition, and on one side it has a picture of Jefferson, and it says Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States. On the back it has two hands shaking, like shaking hands, and then it has a peace pipe and a hatchet, and it says peace and friendship. Now this was one of the earlier peace medals, but it wasn't the first. It was one of the first to go out west for America, and Canadians had the Hudson Bay Company. They sent out little medallions, just things to make friends with the natives. But something like this would have been brought by military expeditions, and they kept doing this for each president up until, gosh, in the 1880s. And so these peace medals were something that were kind of a high-prized item, and usually you'd only see them around the necks of chiefs